honored today to have as our evening keynote Danielle Allen. Danielle Allen is the James Bryant Conant University Professor and Director of the Allen Lab for Democracy Renovation at the Harvard Kennedy School's Ash Center. She's a professor at Harvard, a seasoned leader, public policy and public affairs expert, national voice on pandemic response, and distinguished academic and author. Allen recently co-chaired the Commission on the Practice of Democratic Citizenship, which was formed to explore how best to respond to the weaknesses and vulnerabilities in political and in civic life. Allen is also the author of several books addressing the broad history and personal significance of issues of justice and democracy, including Our Declaration, a reading of the Declaration of Independence in defense of equality, Cause, an American tragedy, and most recently, Justice by Means of Democracy. Danielle Allen's keynote today is How to Be a Confident Pluralist. Dr. Allen.
Thank you, Will, for that introduction, and thank you all for being here. It's a pleasure to be back on this campus. I was last here about 5 years ago, it turns out. I can't believe it's actually been that long for a conversation about civic education. It's terrific to see how much growth there is in the work represented by this school, by SCETL, and by now the many allied schools and centers around the country. So a lot's happened in 5 years, and it's terrific to have the chance to join you in thinking about the implications of the higher education, civic education work that you're all doing. My talk tonight is called How to Be a Confident Pluralist. I think it's in the spirit of a lot of the goals that were articulated on the previous panel and that I expect have been articulated throughout the day. It really is a talk about the ethics of citizenship and what we should be aspiring to in our education of learners at all levels, K through 12 as well as higher ed. But let me say, first of all, what exactly is this figure of the confident pluralist? I want to acknowledge John Inazu's book, the title Confident Pluralism. I think his formulation is excellent and apt, and with his permission, I am fully embracing it as the right way of capturing, again, the ethics of citizenship that we should all be aspiring to. In truth, though, it's not just an abstract idea. Confident pluralists are people. And in my own case, the first people that I had the chance to get to know who fell under this category were members of my own family. I like to start in sharing this picture of what we might do in civic education by explaining why it is I'm personally committed to the projects of democracy and self-government. Those are commitments that, in my case, are matters of long-standing family inheritance. I'm super fortunate in that regard. I come from generations of people who have loved and fought for democracy. On my dad's side, my granddad helped found one of the first NAACP chapters in northern Florida in the 1940s. Super dangerous work. So talk about confidence. You've got a picture of confidence right there on that side of the balance. On the other side of my family, my great-grandparents helped fight for women's right to vote. So my great-granddad even marched with suffragettes on Boston Common in 1917. So on both sides of my family, I come from people who were told that something in the civic space was impossible, that social equality for African Americans in the South was impossible. That's what my granddad heard. Or that women having the right to vote was impossible. That's what my great-grandparents heard. And their answer to this was always no. Not only is it possible, it's necessary. And so the only question is how. And so what these ancestors of mine shared was a commitment to empowerment. Empowerment as the bedrock for human thriving. Empowerment means self-government, that one governs oneself in one's own life, and that one works with others to govern collectively. I was really fortunate then, as a young person, to grow up in a network of super civically engaged people. And my dad had 11 brothers and sisters of incredibly different characteristics and attitudes. So this was a group of people that was engaged all across the political spectrum. To make a point of just how broad their perspectives were, there was one amazing year in my youth, 1992, when my aunt was on the ballot for Congress in the Bay Area for the Peace and Freedom Party, far left-hand side of the spectrum. And my dad in that same year was running for US Senate from Southern California as a Reagan Republican. So we used to have incredible family dinner table conversations. And some of you know my dad, so you know that in those years, early years of my life, 70s, 80s to the 90s, he was always smoking a pipe, super professorial, pipe smoke curling around his head, pretty slender, elegant guy. On the other hand, my aunt was a big woman, built like a Mack truck. She was gay. She was always probing the boundaries of how we did things in society, and they would go at it, sort of hammer and tongs, arguing about the right path. My dad making the case for market liberties and civic virtues. My aunt always making the case for public sector investment in all segments of society and experiments in living. And I was this young person, like going back and forth, trying to figure it out, how to make sense of it. I knew I loved them both, so it couldn't just be a question of picking my favorite person, and then that was the answer. That was not going to be what it was. It meant I had to actually think. I had to engage in the questions. I had to understand what mattered to them and why they were making these different cases. And as I watched them, though, have these incredibly heated arguments that were so heated that to this day, friends of mine from school will come by and say, Danielle, remember that time when I came by your house and your family was engaged in this massive argument? So it was like legendary, these debates. But the thing I learned watching them as they were having these debates was that for all of the intensity of it, they actually agreed on the purpose. They were both pursuing this project of empowerment, the same one that was the project I already named from my ancestors. They agreed on the idea that empowerment was the bedrock for human thriving, for individuals, for families, and for communities. And the debate was about the how. So they shared that common purpose of self-government. They shared that. And then the debate was on the how. The second thing I learned watching them was that, again, for all of the fierceness of their debates, they never broke the bonds of love. It was always clear that they would have each other's back, come what may. They held sacred the dignity of the human being in front of them. And so that, for me, was my school in democracy. These incredibly confident people, clear on what they valued and why, in fact, sharing a purpose despite their disagreement, and then engaging in the debate about the how, always with that core respect for the sacred dignity of the human being in front of them. So it's those people, my dad and my aunt, who really were the first confident pluralists in my life, gave me the aspiration for what I want to be as a civic actor. And I think their example provides a lot of lessons for us about what we can seek to cultivate for learners through civic education. So let's get technical then. Confident pluralist, we need a definition. The confidence side means that one knows what matters to one and why. One has reasons for one's points of view. One can articulate them and therefore recognize that they can withstand scrutiny. That is the source of confidence. Pluralism, well, that is a commitment, of course, to recognizing diversity of views and viewpoints, but where does it come from? Why is it valuable? That commitment to pluralism comes itself from the commitment to empowerment. As I've said, I joined my ancestors in seeing empowerment as the bedrock for human thriving. What I mean by that is the idea that human well-being is about self-government, is about each of us being able to set our own course in life. That means, of course, setting our own course in our private lives, steering our lives, governing ourselves in our private lives. But none of us is a Robinson Crusoe on an island. We live with others. We live in community with others. Our lives are always constrained by the norms and laws and rules of our societies. So if we are going to be empowered, if we are going to be charting our own course in life as self-governing Individuals, we also have to do the work of collective governance, governing ourselves with others as we together govern the whole, as we establish the rules and norms that set the constraints within which we make our choices in our private lives. Now, once one sees that project of self-government and empowerment is at the bedrock of human well-being and thriving, one has to recognize that a necessary result of that celebration of freedom, of self-government, is also a celebration of pluralism. Once one sees value in people governing themselves, one has to recognize that they will make many different kinds of choices about the way to live. They will answer the question of how to live in a diversity of ways. So pluralism, a commitment to it, flows directly from a value of empowerment, directly from respect for freedom and self-governance. Now, once we see that pluralism and individual viewpoint emerges necessarily from a commitment to empowerment, that brings us to the second aspect of pluralism that follows necessarily, and that's the question of pluralism at the social level, what it means for our institutions. Once we recognize that to govern ourselves in collective spaces together requires us to work with others who have different viewpoints, then the question is, well, what can count as a decision-making process in that context that respects that basic freedom, that basic commitment to self-government? The answer to that has to be, as Yuval Levin has frequently argued, institutions. Institutions that we use to wrestle our way to compromises and negotiated settlements that are the collective result of many different pluralistic inputs to a decision-making process. The paradox of self-government is that at the level of what we do together collectively, what comes out the end of the decision-making pipeline will never match perfectly with the individual will of any one of us. The paradox of protecting empowerment is that we also accept a gap between our own wills and what the result is of collective decision-making. And what makes it worthwhile to accept that gap? What makes it worthwhile is precisely the fact that the participation in institutions through which we achieve compromises and negotiated settlements, that participation is itself a form of self-government. It is that one gets the chance to do that work as a part of the collective that is the reward for accepting the gap between where outcomes come out and one's own individual personal will. So the commitment to pluralism flows, as I said, first from that basic commitment to protecting empowerment for all individuals, but then a second feature of that commitment emerges when you realize that collective decision-making requires that we bring together a variety of viewpoints, reach accommodated, compromised decisions, and in that process, give ourselves the opportunity to experience self-government, knowing that it's that experience that is the reward, not the achievement of a result that perfectly matches our own will. All right? That's the challenge of self-government, the paradox of it. All right? But that's the really important part about the concept of pluralism. So then we have our two halves. Confident is the person who knows what matters to them and why. The pluralist is the person who both recognizes that protecting empowerment means a diversity of viewpoints will emerge, and then secondly, recognizes that we reconcile that diversity of viewpoints by working through institutions that yield outcomes that don't align with any of our individual wills perfectly. Okay? So that's my definition for you of a confident pluralist. So now we get to the question of how exactly one can come to be or go about being such a confident pluralist. I'm going to give you a 5-step program for being a confident pluralist. And they're all, honestly, steps that you're all already very well familiar with. One could say that they're the steps of a liberal arts education, and I think you'll hear that as I walk through them in various ways. But the 5 steps are, I'll start by naming them and then spend some time on each of them. Reflection, answering the question of how shall I live? That's step number 1. Step number 2 is committing to nonviolence and to participation in institutional processes for collective decision-making. Step number 3 is accepting compromise as a good thing, as a positive value. We'll spend the most time on that one because that's probably the one that as a society we are most challenged by right now. Step number 4 is learning how to communicate with people by listening to them first, by mirroring what they are saying and checking whether you've understood it before you contribute yourself. And then step number 5 is developing some skills to make sure that nobody ever holds human dignity hostage. And I'll explain what I mean by that when I get to that one. So reflection, what matters to me and why. That's a trite phrase at this point. One can kind of find it probably written over the counter at Starbucks and things like that. It's become a kind of conventional way people use to articulate the idea that we should be authentic in ourselves. But there's really a deeper tradition to that question about what matters to me and why. Yes, it is about authenticity, but as I said, it's also about reflection. And it's really just a version of the Socratic question of how shall I live and how shall we live? The importance of recognizing the Socratic question beneath what matters to me and why is to see the demand, the requirement of the Socratic process and practice. It's not enough to have a flip answer to the question of what matters to me and why. One has to have a reasoned answer, one that can sustain challenge of questions, can be responsive to questions, so that others can understand the foundations for your position. If one works through a process of reflection, that can be in a meditative process, it can be in a prayerful process, it can be in classes on literature where one is checking and experiencing other people's accounts of what matters to them and why. It can be in philosophy courses. It can be by studying figures in history and why they've chosen what they've chosen. The full range of the liberal arts is available to support learning how to reflect on what matters to oneself and why. But what is really critical about that is that students take ownership of that question for themselves. It's not just that they are learning about what others have thought, important as that is. They also have to be challenged to articulate for themselves what are their core commitments. And this matters because then in moments of stress, in moments of tension, if they make a hard choice, make a hard call, they'll be able to stand firm in that hard choice because they understand their reasons for their choice. That's the value of the reflection, is that it actually is what undergirds the confidence when one brings or articulates a viewpoint in public spaces that not everybody will agree with. One needs that foundation of reflection. That's step number 1. Now about that commitment to nonviolence in institutional processes. I'm sure you're all aware of the fact that survey data shows that Americans are becoming increasingly accepting of the potential use of violence to resolve political disputes. So it's not that it's a crisis. It's not a majority of people who are accepting of the notion that we should use violence, but the number is going up. And at the end of the day, any stable system of self-government does require us to recognize that we resolve differences among viewpoints through institutions through which we're negotiating accommodations and compromise. I know that Yuval earlier today spent a lot of time on the Constitution as a structure that does support precisely that kind of work of negotiation. So I'm not going to spend as much time on this point today because I really just want to refer you to Yuval's work on institutions. But to teach students about the centrality of institutions to their own freedom is an important part of the job. Institutions are not separate from us, not apart from us. They simply are the instruments of our freedom, of our empowerment. That's a lesson that I think young people find very hard to learn right now. Social movements, protest, that feels much more accessible as an instrument, experienced as an instrument of empowerment. But much of that work that young people do around protest is really about voice, about expression, and not about influence. Actually being able to act on the basis of what one believes as a part of a collective decision-making process. So helping learners see that the goal is bigger than voice, that the goal is influence, as somebody who participates through institutions is, I think, an important part of the work of civic education. Right? So again, I'll refer you to Yuval for the bigger picture on the value of institutions. So the third point, compromise. Again, those of you who know me know that I am just sort of obsessed with the Declaration of Independence, and I think that almost anything that one needs to learn can be learned through the Declaration of Independence. So indulge me, but I am going to return to the Declaration of Independence again to talk about compromise. We talk a lot about how compromises show up in the Constitution. We lose track of the fact that they also show up in the Declaration of Independence. There are really two critical compromises in the Declaration, one around enslavement and one around religion. And I like to point this out because often, I think, for young people, compromise these days is just a bad word. It just means you sort of have not actually stood up for what you care about. It seems as if it's in contradiction to that first element of confident pluralism that I mentioned, where you know what matters to you and why. So the question is, how can we start to help young people understand the difference between good compromises and bad compromises? That distinction is necessary, I think, for reactivating a sense of engagement with the art of compromise. Now, for me, as I said, there are two compromises in the Declaration, and I take one to be an example of a good compromise and one to be an example of a bad compromise. The good compromise in the Declaration is the one around religion, where we see in the text the language of the Creator, we're all created equal. We see the language at the end of the text about divine providence and the supreme judge. And it's a very interesting rhetorical strategy in the text. We also see, for example, the beginning of the text invoke the laws of nature and nature's God. And in that phrase, the laws of nature and nature's God, the Declaration is giving us a sort of belt and suspenders approach to the question of the moral foundations for its argument. You might be somebody who is a deist, not committed to a theology. You're okay with the concept that the laws of nature provide you a grounding for the moral argument in the Declaration. Or perhaps you are committed to the existence of a deity. Nature's God speaks to you as the grounding for the moral foundation of the Declaration. The remaining words in the text, again, creator, created, divine providence, supreme judge, these are all words that did not speak to any specific theological tradition, any specific religious tradition. So when you look at the rhetorical argument of the Declaration, what you see is a mode of engaging that was speaking to all of the different positions about a divinity, about religion, then in existence in the colonies. In other words, everybody's perspective was woven into figuring out the compromise around the moral foundations of the Declaration of Independence. The secularist, the deist, the atheist, the faithful, all could see an argument that spoke to them and their positions in the argument of the Declaration of Independence. With regard to the compromise around enslavement, this one less successful, and the reason will be obvious as soon as I articulate it. The actual compromise in the text comes in two places. The phrase life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is an anti-enslavement moment in the text. It's an abolitionist moment in the text. By the point the Declaration was drafted in July of 1776, life, liberty, and property had become a phrase where property was closely connected to a defense of slavery. So the substitution of happiness for slavery was avoiding any necessary invocation of the rights of slaveholders. And John Adams from Massachusetts, never supported enslavement, was the person who led the argument for the use of the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. That was his vocabulary. He'd been developing it over the course of the year. That was the abolitionist moment in the Declaration. The pro-slavery moment in the Declaration came when Congress cut out of the first draft a passage that criticized King George for continuing the slave trade. And many of you know this passage. This is the passage in which the criticism is that the king has violated the sacred rights of life and liberty of a distant people in Africa. In other words, the draft had attributed the same rights to people in Africa as the colonists themselves had. That language went too far for those who wanted to defend enslavement, and Congress pulled that language out of the draft. So the final version of the Declaration had the phrase life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which permitted both the slaveholding South and the less slaveholding North to agree on an overall statement of direction, and removed the passage that criticized King George. But what was missing from this compromise? In contrast to the compromise around religion, for this compromise, one can't say that all those who were affected by it were taken into consideration in its formulations and in its consequences. Those who were enslaved at the time were not considered in the structure of that compromise. Its result cannot have reflected their point of view. And so one can take the contrast between those two compromises and begin to articulate a picture of what counts as a good compromise, one which really does get the viewpoints of all those who are affected, the stakeholders, as we also call them, into the conversation together to work on the negotiation to the solution. The bad compromise is the one that fails to include all those who are affected in the process of negotiation. So that's step 3, the art of compromise, and it is a hard and complicated art, and I've only touched the surface of it, again, for the purpose of trying to restore a concept that there are such things as good compromises, and we want to understand what they are and how they got made. So the 4th step I mentioned was talking by listening. We often spend time thinking about how we should encourage students to talk to others as they work on a project of civil discourse and civil disagreement. John Inazu, for example, enjoins us not to use insults, and he's right to enjoin us that way. And he enjoins us not to use conversation-stopping remarks, and he's right about that. But in a certain sense, I think an even more important point is to say that talking starts with listening. It starts with checking whether you've understood. And I have now come to make it one of my basic teaching practices in all my courses, so not just my civic education courses, that my students, before they respond to another student in any discussion setting, they have the job of first repeating back what they think they've heard, repeating back what they think they're responding to check whether or not they've heard it correctly. And I'm sure you can imagine what the result of this exercise is, which is that 9 out of 10 times they have not heard correctly. And in fact, the whole discussion ends up being one of back and forth as the two try to actually understand each other. And when that happens, then I consider my job to be done. That they've begun to learn that they're not actually hearing each other, and they're beginning to develop the skills to do so, and to take that moment to stop and make sure they've understood before they counter with something else. So the last one is about not letting anybody hold human dignity hostage. This is a way of putting a request, an encouragement that we all do our part to undo the problems of toxic culture that we are so broadly and consistently experiencing these days. The way I'm going to give you an example of this is to share with you a personal project I've been embarked on for a few years. I call it my Trolling My Trolls project. And what it means is, at a certain point, I found myself very frustrated with how negative, insulting, incoming language coming over the transom, over email and so forth, was affecting me. And I decided I didn't want to let my own human dignity be held hostage by people who were speaking to me in various nasty ways and the like. So I started responding to my trolls in a way that I hoped would exhibit that I was not going to let human dignity be held hostage. So I'm going to just read you one email exchange to give you a sense of how this goes. This is sort of a short one, and what some of the results are. So this is from early November, came in with the subject line, "Aren't you ashamed? Aren't you ashamed to be associated with an institution that supports anti-Semitism and terrorism? I don't know how you can sleep at night. You're a despicable human being." Okay, that one was not so bad, actually, okay? Truly. And I'm going to make up the name of the person, okay? "Dear Mr. Smith, thank you for your kind note. I wonder if you've taken the time to read my own contributions on the subject. If not, you'll find them here." And then a link to something I had written on the subject of Israel and Gaza. "Best wishes, Danielle." "Dr. Allen, thank you for responding and sending me your writing on the subject. I found it very sensible and thoughtful, and I obviously was not well informed about your thoughts on this. These are indeed difficult times, and sometimes one should spend more time thinking and taking a deep breath before lashing out at someone. Please accept my apology. That's what I'm always going for. That's the true thing I'm going for in my Trolling My Trolls project, the apology. Anyway, thanks again for responding and educating me. Ray. Dear Ray, thank you very much for taking the time to read my piece, for writing back again, and for your apology. You've made my day. It's my birthday, and this note is a great birthday present. With appreciation, Danielle. Dr. Allen, let me then wish you a very happy birthday, and hope you do something very special for yourself. Even though I lashed out in hostility towards you, you turned the interaction into something very positive and taught me something about myself. I guess that's why you're a professor. If only everyone could do that same thing, we'd live in a better world. I hope at the very least I brought a little smile to your face on your special day. You're one of the lights you write about in your article. Thanks again, Danielle, and have a very happy birthday, Ray. And then I wrote back again, thanks again, I appreciate it. Let's work on that better world. So that one was really short, actually, and easy. So in that regard, it's not necessarily the best example. But it's literally the case that 9 times out of 10, when somebody writes to me and says, aren't you despicable? How can you sleep at night? Within 3 or 4 emails back and forth, where all I've done is just be polite, they return to being the human self they truly want to be. So that's the 5th suggestion for how to be a confident pluralist, is not to let people hold human dignity hostage. So when people are hurling insults, when they are throwing conversation stoppers, there's still something that you can do, which is to refuse to participate in that, to reset the standard toward respect for their dignity. Do your best to hear what they are trying to say. I have lots of these. I'll stop myself from sharing any more right now. But the really deepest lesson that I've gotten from them and from the effort to respond to people in this way is that every single person who writes to me, I should say every single one, 9 out of 10 of them, that would be the accurate count, who write to me in this way, have something that they are actually trying to share. But they just, in fact, haven't had the opportunity to do so recently. And they are grateful for somebody who actually just wants to hear what it is they're trying to say and is willing to take what they have to say seriously. So there's a real lesson in that, I believe, again, about what it means to be a confident pluralist. So finally, the point there is that our confidence isn't just in ourselves when we are confident pluralists, it's in our fellow human beings. It's in their aspirations and their capacity to step up to engage in this way. So that leads me to my final remarks about civic education. It really is this ethics of citizenship that I think is so necessary for a healthy democracy. And I do think it's incumbent on us as educators to help our students become these confident pluralists. It doesn't have to be just in civic ed courses. As I said, in all my classes, I teach my students how to hear each other before they engage with each other. And that's a very basic piece of the lesson. But our civic education courses are necessary. And beyond what we do here in higher ed, I do think we need, we need those of us who work in higher ed also to support the K through 12 space, so that our K through 12 education is already laying the foundation for learners to engage in this way with one another and with the project of self-government. Thank you. Excuse me.
Well, Danielle, thank you very much for an evocative talk and your personal experience about not only the formative family influences of debate and discussion and becoming confident with differing opinions, but also, in closing, talking about how to be a confident pluralist by engaging critics. And as I said earlier today in a different session, we're not just about the theory of civic education, but also the practice of civic education. And part of teaching civic education is to be civil, and to disagree civilly, and to be able to draw harmony out of disagreement. And that gets to the question of a toxic culture. And one level of this you've just engaged. You've talked about trolling the trolls. And the really hateful comments, and I'm glad you only skim the surface of what I imagine can be a quite vile, this is a common theme of just the vile things people will say, particularly when they believe that they are anonymous and they can get away with it, that anonymity becomes a shield and that leads to the worst cases of bad behavior, the worst of human nature. But that's on a personal level. That's a one-to-one, engaging somebody else and then drawing them, in a sense, educating them, drawing them out into something else. What I'd like to ask you is, how do you deal with not the micro, but the macro of toxic culture? And one way I would describe this is shouty people being shouty. That it's not a civil debate, it's not even a debate at all, but the shaking the fist, the shouting the slogans, it's not a discussion, and it's not necessarily engaged at a single person. It's not commenting to Professor Allen or to Danielle, but simply shouting, expressing your voice in a very angry way. How do you deal, how to promote civility can you engage shouty people and avoid the response of those who aren't shouty of just dropping out?
No, I appreciate the question, and the seeming distance between the micro and the macro, I think, is one of the hardest questions for those of us who want a healthy civic culture. And I don't think I have a good answer for you. I think, like many here, I tend to try to work in both dimensions simultaneously. I try to think about institutional changes that would change incentive systems and help generate better behavior. So for example, I'm a supporter of ranked choice voting. It's a mode of voting where you rank your preferences first, second, third, fourth. It has the effect of meaning that candidates, when they campaign, need to campaign to be not just a voter's first choice, but also second choice and third choice. And so it does not serve them well to demonize their opponent, because they want to actually pick up their opponent's voters, to be their opponent's voter's second choice person and the like. And there's good empirical evidence that you see negativity reducing in contexts where ranked choice voting is used. So I do think that there are some structural changes like that we could pursue. Abolishing party primaries and replacing them with all-comers primaries is another one of that kind. And I think we should pursue those. But by the same token, I don't want to give up on the power of the micro. And I think I've become more of a believer in the micro over time. And in some sense, one of the reasons I read that email out, or I've read other emails in other contexts, is just to try to help people believe, again, that it is actually possible for us to change the dynamic that we experience all around us. On the idea that if each of us starts to believe again, and if we can then each of us convince 6 more people to believe again, and keep spreading it out, you can actually change the dynamic of the culture. And I do think that's a necessary thing, because I think at the end of the day, the problems we face are deeply moral problems. They're not just structural or about incentive systems. I think we have to rehumanize our relationships with each other, and I think that's a moral project. So for me, the micro is really critical.
One of the themes you brought out in your remarks today is about collective decision-making. And we need to agree on everything, but we need to be able to work together, find, you have a Latin phrase, modus operandi, a way to move forward, to operate together, to work together. And that's very, very important. But there is a question about where the line falls between what we do together, the public thing, the res publica, the republic, and the private sphere. And so how do we deal with situations where the collective infringes upon the private sphere of perhaps family, or of the personal preference, or of smaller communities and their interests? how do we avoid a kind of hostile majoritarianism or the loudest talkers infringing and thereby raising the temperature?
No, I think that's a great question, and I think that is basically exactly the hardest thing that we are routinely wrestling with, right? Our hardest policy debates, political debates tend to be exactly about that question of what's a public interest question and what's a private interest question. There's not a once and for all a priori answer to that question. I mean, that is exactly part of what it is our job to negotiate. But one of the reasons I am making the case for confident pluralism is to expand the possibility set for diversity of ways of life that we can imagine coexisting, so that we can accept the idea that there will be different communities in different places pursuing different answers to the question of how should we live, and respect that. I do think we are in a moment in our politics where, from both sides, there's a sort of expectation that if there's a kind of clear view about a way to live, it should be the whole view for everybody. And so in advocating for confident pluralism, I am trying to make more space for the notion that it really is okay that you can have a hyper-religious community in one place and a hyper-secular community in another place, and we can actually live together and work together.
Well, some of this brings to mind, as an historian, I'm sort of one of the people of the book, not in the sense of scripture, but in the sense of books, that you think of books, of what people have written. And a Harvard colleague of yours, Charles Mayer in the history department, is now, I believe, emeritus, he has a recent book recasting the 20th century around the theme of project states, where of political orders, some democratic, some anti-democratic, that are oriented around a particular project. It could be a good project, it could be a bad project, it could be a totally evil project. But one of the things that book brings out for me is, how do you deal with the people who don't buy the project? This may seem like a repetition of the last theme, but that's a real challenge of if there is a truly passionate commitment to a project and other people say, well, not me, that becomes a very tense and challenging issue.
Yes, again, so you like hard questions.
Being tough.
Definitely a host of hard questions here. So one of the data points that has been one of my, keep me awake at night data points over recent years is the data point from political scientists Yascha Mounk and Roberta Foa about youth disaffection from democracy. And in the starkest formulation that they offered, they point out that for the generation born before World War II, roughly 70% of Americans consider it essential to live in a democracy. In contrast, for Americans who are millennials and younger, not quite 30% consider it essential to live in a democracy. That's a very, very alarming statistic, but after reflecting on it for quite some time, I realized that there was another interesting piece of information in this statistic, and that was that the high watermark of connection to our democracy for that generation born before World War II was 70%, okay? So you're never gonna get everybody on board, even for the project of constitutional democracy. I use the language of empowerment and self-government, but I also mean by that the project of constitutional democracy. And so in that regard, I see one of the jobs that we collectively have right now as being to build a cross-ideological supermajority for constitutional democracy. That those of us who care about this project should be aiming for that 70% of people who do feel that sense of connection. If you're aiming for a supermajority, it has to be cross-ideological. And I guess my answer to you would be that if we can get to that 70% supermajority, then I don't mind about the other 30%.
The other 30%.
Yeah, as long as they don't have bombs and other things to address that particular theme.
Well, a lot of this seems rooted in your most recent book, Justice by Means of Democracy, that came out last year. And constitutional democracy involves complicated sets of institutions, different levels of government, features that conservatives like, but you believe that these protections for individual and political liberty can fit together with the ideals of equality that you've emphasized in your theory of democracy. And would you elaborate a bit on some of this?
Sure, no, absolutely. So over the course of many books that I've written, I have made the case that freedom and equality are mutually reinforcing ideals. They're not antithetical as people have often thought. That depends on focusing on equality as political equality specifically, right? So one of the challenges with our conversations about equality is that we often don't distinguish which kind of equality we're talking about. So in my argument, basic human dignity is a feature of moral equality that we share, and because of our moral equality as human beings, and the fact that our best lives depend on the access to empowerment, we also have a right to political equality. And that political equality is a right that we all have for freedom. None of us can have freedom unless we're free from domination by others. And so equality, political equality, is also a way of thinking about what freedom from domination is. So that is how those concepts fit together. And there are things that are further entailments. It does mean that social equality becomes important as a part of understanding the operations of political equality. It does mean that things like economic egalitarianism, I would say, become important, because if you have an excessively unequal economy, it will endanger political equality. So my argument really starts from putting political equality and freedom together and asking the question then of what do you need by way of economic policy and the like to get sort of more middle-class economy, in effect, to hold up the edifice of self-government.
Well, I think that's a very good point, that self-government, the foundation of self-government is not being governed by somebody else, and not being governed by somebody else against your will. That if somebody else sets a rule and you'd have followed it anyway, well, that's you're still governing yourself in a sense, because you're doing it anyway. But when others are governing you, and particularly contrary to your beliefs, that's a real problem. And recovering an understanding of self-government seems to be a challenge, and this is something that fits with civic education. And you were one of the lead authors on a national K-12 civics and history education study in 2021, Educating for American Democracy. And you had brought in, and this seems like a really good example of your efforts to be a confident pluralist, bringing people center-left, center-right, and you and other colleagues involved in that wanted to broaden the base and not have it seem one-sided in any way. So your ideas of confident pluralism really fits into a lot of this work. How can we build a curriculum to reflect and to, as you say, do the work better?
No, I appreciate that. And I want to thank Paul Carice. Where did Paul go? There you are. For his terrific work on the Educating for American Democracy roadmap. And that roadmap, which does seek to provide a framework for the development of reflective patriotism for young learners, one of the themes of this conference, is also a framework for developing confident pluralism. So I think reflective patriotism and confident pluralism go together. I would consider them two anchor concepts for the roadmap. Maybe I'll tell you a little story about our work, if that's okay, just to share what it's like to try to do the work across viewpoint lines. And some of you may have heard the story. Paul's heard it a million times, so you'll have to forgive me.
You're not going to share one of my emails, are you?
No, I promise. I'll change your name if I do. I'll change your name if I ever do share it. So, that we all, as we got together and tried to start building a group of people from different viewpoint places, we said to ourselves, look, we know we're going to hit disagreements, but we're doing this work because we have a shared sense of urgency about the fact that kids need a heck of a lot stronger, richer civic education. And that shared urgency is going to be our commitment, so that we're going to, when we hit points of disagreement, we're just going to sort of stop and wrestle things through. And so, if you've heard me say this before, please tell me. We had to stop within 2 weeks of starting our work. Like, it only took 2 weeks before we hit an argument. We're like, we can't keep going forward. And our argument was about what exactly were we educating kids for anyway. And the question was, were we educating them for life in a republic, or were we educating them for life in a democracy? I mean, we were stopped. We were just totally paralyzed by this question. And we realized as we did the work of listening to each other and trying to hear that, of course, the argument for a republic reflects the values of constitutionalism, rule of law, order, and structure. The arguments for democracy reflect the values of inclusion, popular sovereignty, participation, and the like. So recognizing the substance behind each position, our compromise was that we are educating kids for life in a constitutional democracy. So that is where that phrase in our work came from. And we consistently hit points like that, where we just had really serious, different starting positions, good reasons for both of them. We knew what mattered to us and why on both sides. And because we knew what mattered to us and why, we could articulate that and then find our way towards another compromise position.
Well, this brings to mind the idea of the narcissism of small differences. Republic,
a little bit,
or
you would think, yeah.
that sometimes, but as you say, once you start going through this, well, what do you mean?
Right.
What does this mean? And then you find out that the differences are less clear, or can lead to good compromises.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
You're right, because at some level it was narcissism of small differences. Both terms were in use at the founding. Sometimes that's a point that gets lost sight of, but Hamilton called the Constitution a design for a representative democracy. Madison, of course, celebrated the concept of republic. So it really is narcissism of small differences. And yet, as we know, we have at this point, huge blocks of public opinion that sort according to which of those terms is used. In fact, one of my emails just this week from my friends was, communist, because you use the word democracy. That was the first line in the email. So anyway, so it's a real thing out there.
That yes, I mean, this points to the problem of definition as well. What do you mean by and you raise the question of equality. People say, well, equality, that's a good thing, right? It's in the Declaration of Independence, it means this. But then what that means, and the definition, and also what it means in practice, how does one apply this, becomes a real issue.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, there's a lot of intellectual history in that, and we could spend a lot of time on it. I mean, so over the course of the 19th century through the early 20th, as the economic facts of the world changed with industrialization and then the rise of Marxism, yes, equality became closely connected to economic concepts specifically. And as that changed, the definition of freedom also evolved. The 18th century definition was really a kind of freedom from domination concept. And then late 19th, early 20th century, we get more of a freedom from interference concept. And that's juxtaposed against sort of, approaches to interfering in the economy that flowed out of Marxism. And so you get the kind of equality, freedom opposition that has become common in our understanding. But both concepts are much richer than that and deserve our much fuller and deeper engagement. And
the task really becomes one of, in figuring out how we can live together, it becomes one of what they mean in practice, not simply in theory, but how do you apply an idea in a particular context to a particular problem.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well, one challenge or one point that comes to mind with educating for democracy, educating for American democracy, is the question of patriotism. And earlier on today, we haven't said much about patriotism so far. How does one reconcile pluralism with patriotism? That on the one hand, we look back, patria, fatherland, a tradition, or looking back to the Declaration. How do we reconcile this with a complicated, pluralistic society, and pluralistic in more ways than one?
Well, as I mentioned, we really drew on, thanks to Paul's influence, the Tocquevillian concept of reflective patriotism in our work for the K through 12 roadmap. And that's a powerful one, right? Because patriotism is as much about the thinking work you have to do in a democracy as anything else, or in a republic, or in a constitutional democracy. So I think that's an important part of it. Also, of course, one can also just think of Madison and Federalist 10 and the basic argument that freedom brings diversity by definition. Freedom brings faction by definition. So the project of freedom, of being committed to that, is by definition a project of commitment to pluralism. So in that regard, I don't see any tension between the concepts of patriotism and pluralism.
Well, in a sense, one of the reasons we have to be patriotic is harmonizing discourse, finding a way to bring different opinions, plurum, into one.
Well, absolutely. And again, I mean, I think I'll invoke Yuval again here. I mean, it's about the Constitution at the end of the day. The thing that makes Americans Americans is the fact that we have the Constitution to hold on to. That is what we share. We are a society pulled together by ideas and by that commitment to the work we do together. Now, it's not of blood, it's not even of religion, even with there being dominant religions in the country. It is a creedal, we are a creedal society, and our creed is the Constitution. And it is that patriotism, you can't be committed to the Constitution without being reflective, because the Constitution demands thought by definition. So to say that we are a creedal society defined by our commitment to the Constitution is to say that we are also defined by our committed to being a thinking people. We have set a high bar for ourselves. Our forefathers, our founders, set a high bar for us as we embrace our heritage, our ancestors, as I started with. We claim that high bar for ourselves. I think that's what this conversation about civic thought is fundamentally about. How, and I think Jenna made this point brilliantly, how when students come in, not necessarily starting with the most challenging texts or challenging resources, do we help them raise the bar? That is what is required of us, I think.
Well, thank you. And now we'd like to open to audience questions. If you have a question, please ask it. And if you have a speech, please hold off.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely wonderful. And I love your 5 points. But I can imagine somebody, and you said you would talk about the compromise part, and you did to some extent, but I can certainly imagine somebody saying, yeah, I don't want to compromise. And in fact, compromise is a kind of failure to me. I want to hold to my principles no matter what, come hell or high water. And so your idea of compromise just doesn't persuade me. What would you say to a student, particularly, who says something like that?
It's a great question, and I think I would love, I hope this whole room can think about it. For me, what I try to do is reanimate the project of freedom and self-government. I try to connect to the fact that you want to stand on principle as an expression of who you are and your commitments. So I take that to be an indication that you are committed to this project of your own will and therefore freedom, and then I try to work through them the question of what freedom requires. And then the paradox that I came to with you all tonight about the fact that it does actually require working together on collective decision making. That's how we express our freedom. So I try to bring them from that point where just the pure expressiveness of their point of view counts as freedom to them, to a place where influencing a collective decision by collaborating and compromising with others is that higher bar for what counts as freedom.
I guess one thing I noticed in your talk is this emphasis on equality and dignity, the dignity of the human person. For a person who does not believe in the dignity of the human person, I presume that we're all here for some reason or another because we somehow believe in it. But there are certainly those who don't, at least in the individual. Is there a way they can buy into this pluralism? And if so, how?
Wow, like I said, hard questions. You have a community of hard question askers. Thank you for that. So that is another, I think, version of the question of what do you do when people don't buy into the project? And you will hear that I have made respect for human dignity a defining feature of the project that I am articulating. So I do think it is actually necessary. So does that mean that one gives up on people who haven't embraced that commitment? It doesn't. There is always work of persuasion to do, always work of re-engagement to do. I think in my personal experience, there are fewer people who do reject that idea than it might sometimes seem on the surface. That people are reasonably certain about wanting that their own dignity to be respected, and that is usually a place from which one can connect them to the need to respect the dignity of others. This is a place, of course, where faith traditions are really important. They have, for a long time, carried the burden of anchoring that commitment to human dignity. It is also possible to carry and anchor that commitment through moral traditions that are secular. And so it's nourishing the traditions that support that commitment is the important work to do.
Hi, Danielle. Thank you for coming. I'm wondering if there's not a tension between the two halves of your talk. I am in full agreement on the need for reflection and on compromise. But the chief virtue that gets me there is humility, especially intellectual humility, political humility, sort of sense of I might get something, but I need to give something. I need to be aware of the limits of my knowledge. That seems fundamentally at odds with empowerment. Because if I'm empowered, then I want to get my way, right? Then I want to sort of seize the moment. I want to have the initiative. I want to sort of get involved in the scrum. And even if I might compromise, I want to move the needle of what I'm getting further down the field, right, to the expense of my fellow citizens or whoever I might be engaging with. So I'm wondering if you can maybe tease that out a little bit and explain why it's not a tension, because it seems like those two parts are fundamentally at odds with one another.
Great, no, thank you. That's an excellent question. I appreciate that. So for starters, I mean, humility is absolutely a necessary virtue for a confident pluralist. I would endorse that as a starting point. And John Inazu's work makes humility, for example, a central characteristic of the confident pluralist. So the way, for me, the pieces come together, that is the argument I was making about the need for reasoning as a basis for what matters to you and why, being able to articulate your reasons. I didn't say out loud, but would happily extend the point to add that the point of having reasons is also to recognize that you can err in your reasoning and to be ready to look for correction. So I often make the case that one needs to start from an expectation of fallibilism, sort of a different kind of approach that, we're all human beings. Our judgment is deficient. None of us are perfect in our judgment. So this is the best reasoning I can provide, but I have to start by assuming that I may also have made a mistake. So for me, it's actually in that component that is about the importance of reasoning that the virtues of humility come in. And so then, yes, I mean, the space of compromise and negotiation shouldn't just be about kind of like bare knuckle, who can we get to give way so I can get this or that. It should also be about mutual learning. So I think those are really important extensions, and I appreciate your question.
Hello, Danielle. Thank you for your comments today. I had a question about your remark that protest is about voice and expression and not about influence. Really two questions. So one, do you think the true purpose or the highest purpose of protest, the best purpose of protest, would be to attain a position in which you could then exercise influence? In other words, sometimes you need to make a kind of fuss before you're enabled to get a seat at the table. And then secondly, if that's so, I have a practical question about campus life, which is, do you have any thoughts about the kinds of policies or practices or incentives that one could put into place to move students from a position in which they're focused on protest and expression to a position in which they're focused on maybe using that, but in order to get a seat at a table in which they can engage in the work of compromise that you're talking about, because that would be maturing, right? And like, how can we move how can we make campus protests more productive?
Right. So it's a great question. Thank you, Jenna. And I mean, this is another place where I feel like there's a lot of work to be done, and it would be great to have everybody in this room contributing to that work. So first, just a few background points. One of the interesting features of political science over the last 30 or 40 years or so is that the discipline has added social movements to the categories of things that drive politics, right? So once upon a time you studied the executive power and legislative power and Congress and so forth, judiciary, and now also one studies social movements alongside that. And one needs to understand all 4 things, and the administrative state, 5 things, to understand the operations of this democracy. I think that's a salutary and honest evolution of the discipline from the point of view of what it takes to account for how politics unfolds in the US. At the same time that has happened, I don't think we have intellectually fully achieved a kind of integration of understanding about the sort of social movement side and the institutional side. So I think as a matter of political science, we still need to achieve that integration. I think if we can achieve that in political science, it will get easier to teach students how to see the pieces fitting together. And we do struggle because at this point, our political institutions feel very distant to most people and opaque. And the question of how one has any agency in relationship to them is very challenging for people to get their heads around. So in work I do in the K-12 context, we spend a lot of time educating students about how municipal government works, just so that they plain know how to do things in their own local environment. And I think we actually have to rebuild that education in order to connect protest to something productive. I think for a lot of students, the question of how institutions work is a true blank space. So I think honestly that it's not even that they're choosing not to participate institutionally. I think it's literally a blank space for them.
Thank you so much for your comments. I adore the trolling the trolls formulation. I think that's so helpful, and it does work. I mean, I think you're completely right about that. And also, you're having students say what they think they've heard. Mm-hmm. That's just genius.
That's just marriage therapy, but
yeah,
anyway.
Well,
I wish I could say it was genius, but anyway.
I'm leading up to a possible macro question, because I do appreciate, the person in front of you is the one you can deal with. But we deal with a student life apparatus that encourages students to report rather than address.
Right.
So what might be some strategies for dealing with that? We can't remake the whole student life apparatus.
That is super interesting. Thank you for that question. That's really helpful. Because it's interesting, as I share my project of responding to the people who send me nasty emails, the most common response I get is more or less like, why are you doing that? And isn't that just somebody who should be reported? And I've explained to you why I do it. I mean, partly it was because I found it was having too much of a negative impact on me, and I wanted to reassert my own control over the situation. And then once I did that, I discovered it worked, and that there were real people trying to say real things on the other side of that first pass of nastiness. And so then that has kept me connected to the project. So I don't think I have a good answer to your question, but I really appreciate it. And I think what it points to is the need to try to help people understand. I mean, the examples I'm giving that I gave you are the worst ones are like if somebody says some of these things in a classroom, it would really not be okay, right? Nonetheless, I think that question of the sort of educative response, the pedagogic response to that, needs attention. And the question would be, what can we ask of our students of helping each other come back to a better place before we get to a point of accusation or reporting? I think it will take a lot of thought to answer that question, understand, in a classroom context, what is the right framework for that. But I really appreciate the suggestion and look forward to thinking more about it.
Thank you, Danielle. My question is prompted by what I thought was your really intriguing discussion of good and bad compromises in the Declaration of Independence. And so what I wanted to ask you is the extent to which and the way in which you think that an assessment of what is possible should play into a determination of whether a compromise is good or bad in the moment. In other words, is it necessary to make a prudential judgment about is a better compromise even feasible under these circumstances
Yeah.
in order to make a judgment about whether the compromise is on the whole acceptable or not? Because with respect to
Right.
the way you labeled one of the compromises on the whole a good compromise,
Yep.
the other on the whole a bad compromise, I didn't hear you comment on was
Right.
a better compromise with respect to language related to slavery in the Declaration on the table? Was it
Right.
something that could really be pursued successfully in the moment?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and it's a fair question. Thank you for it. I mean, I think what I would want to do is split your question into sort of two parts. I think the feasibility question is relevant, but I think it's actually separate from the moral evaluation of the compromise. And so I suppose that's what I would first want to sustain that distinction so that I could hold on to comparing the two on purely moral terms, leaving the question of feasibility aside. But I think it's a fair question to raise the point about feasibility. A challenge is that because of the moral limitations of the engagement with slavery, we don't actually know what the spectrum of the feasible was, right? Because there wasn't any condition in which those who were enslaved were in any way part of the conversation to figure out were there any alternatives here. So that challenges the feasibility question.